Working the night shift in the White House wasn't as glamorous as people think. I was part of the security team, assigned to patrol the West Wing while most of DC slept. The hallways were silent, bathed in a dim glow from emergency lights, and the sound of my own footsteps echoed eerily through the marble floors. Most nights were routine: check the doors, monitor the cameras, and report any odd activity. But this night would be different. It started at exactly 11:58 p.m., just 2 minutes before midnight. I was standing near the Oval Office, reviewing my usual checklist, when the air turned ice cold. The temperature in the White House was always regulated, yet my breath suddenly misted in front of me. I adjusted my jacket, brushing it off as a draft from the vents. But then, the radio on my belt crackled with static, a sharp, unnatural noise that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my radio, pressing the button. "Control, I'm getting interference on my radio near the Oval Office. Do you copy?" The response was nothing but garbled whispers. I frowned, tapping the device to clear the noise, but the whispers continued, faint, indistinct, like multiple voices speaking at once. I looked around, scanning the hallway, but there was no one there. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the radio fell silent again. Shaking off the unease, I continued my patrol, stepping cautiously into the Oval Office. The room was pristine, just as it should be. The famous resolute desk stood in the center, moonlight casting soft shadows across its intricate carvings. The president's chair faced the window, unmoving. The American flag stood tall in the corner, completely still. But then I noticed something odd, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder. My eyes scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source. Then I saw it. On the desk, one of the pens was rolling back and forth, as if an invisible hand were toying with it. My throat went dry. The room was completely still. There was no draft, no movement. The pen suddenly stopped and then rolled toward me. I took a step back, instinctively reaching for my radio again. But before I could press the button, the president's chair creaked. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone was shifting their weight in it. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to look. The chair was still facing the window, unmoved. Yet I could feel something sitting there, watching. Swallowing hard, I took a slow, steady breath. "This is Officer Carter," I said into the radio, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need confirmation. Is anyone scheduled to be in the West Wing right now?" Silence. Then, finally, a response. "Negative, Carter. You're the only one in that section." My grip tightened around the radio as my heart pounded in my chest. The president's chair remained perfectly still, yet I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something was in it. Watching, waiting. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. I took a hesitant step forward, pulse hammering against my ribs. And then, the chair moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, turning ever so slightly toward me. Not fast, not abrupt, just enough to send a deep, primal terror crawling through my veins. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug, and for a split second I swore I saw, just for a fraction of a second, the faintest outline of a figure sitting there, transparent, barely visible, yet undeniably there. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The chair remained facing the desk, perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. My breath came in shaky gulps as I scanned the room, trying to regain control. I needed to get out. But as I turned toward the door, every light in the room flickered. A sharp electric buzz filled the air, and the overhead chandelier blinked erratically, casting wild shadows that seemed to move on their own. My radio crackled again, and this time, through the static, I heard it. A voice. "Not alone here." Every hair on my body stood on end. The voice was distorted, like it was being dragged through layers of static, but I had heard it, clear as day. The lights flickered violently one last time, and then darkness. My breathing was the only sound in the pitch-black room. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the desk, the flags, the portraits on the wall. All normal. But then I panned left, toward the corner where the American flag stood. And there it was, a silhouette. Not fully formed, but tall, unnaturally thin, standing rigidly by the window. The flashlight flickered in my hand, the batteries draining instantly. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a trick of the light. It was there, and it was watching me. I took a step back, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But before I could move, a deafening bang echoed through the room, like a heavy fist slamming onto the resolute desk. Papers scattered. My flashlight died completely. And then, whispers. Soft, insidious, crawling through the air like tendrils of smoke. I couldn't make out the words, but they were everywhere, overlapping, growing louder, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were pleas, begging. I stumbled toward the door, adrenaline surging through my veins. But just as I reached for the handle, the temperature plummeted again. My breath came out in clouds, my fingers trembling. And then, something grabbed my wrist. Not a hand, not fingers, but something cold, wrapping around me like an unseen force. It yanked me backward with terrifying strength, pulling me away from the exit. I slammed into the desk, gasping for breath. The moment I hit the wood, the whispers stopped. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in from all sides. I lay there frozen, my heart beat a frantic drum in my ears. Then, slowly, the chair at the desk turned the rest of the way. And for the first time, I saw it. A face, if you could call it that. Hollow, sunken eyes, an expression stretched into something unnatural. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stared. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it said, "They never left." A cold gust of air slammed into me, knocking the breath from my lungs. My body convulsed as an unseen force shoved me out of the room, hurling me through the doorway. I hit the marble floor outside, skidding to a stop, my ears ringing. The door to the Oval Office slammed shut behind me. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the cold marble floor of the hallway. My limbs felt weak, as if whatever had grabbed me had drained the very strength from my body. I turned to the Oval Office door, half expecting it to fly open, but it didn't. It just sat there, shut, silent, almost as if nothing had happened. For a moment I considered running, getting the hell out of there and never coming back. But something inside me needed to know the truth. What had I seen? Who had I seen? And why did it feel like this wasn't just some ordinary haunting? I reached for my radio with shaking fingers and pressed the button. "Agent Carter? Do you copy?" Static. I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone? Something's wrong." This time there was a response. But it wasn't from Carter. "They never left." The same distorted voice from before. A sickening wave of dread flooded my chest as I dropped the radio like it had burned me. That voice, it wasn't human. I turned away, forcing myself down the hallway. I needed to get out now. As I moved, my mind raced. The White House had seen everything. Presidents, assassinations, wars, betrayals. How many secrets were buried here, and how many of them never left? I reached the main corridor leading to the security wing, but just as I stepped forward, I froze. There was a man standing at the far end of the hallway, dressed in an old black suit, a hat low over his face, motionless. The moment I saw him, the air changed. He wasn't supposed to be here. I took a step back, and the figure tilted its head, ever so slightly. My stomach dropped. It knew I could see it. I blinked, and it was closer. Not walking, not moving, just closer. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the marble, my breath ragged as I darted through the corridors. The walls seemed to stretch, the paintings twisting in my peripheral vision. I knew these hallways. I had walked them 100 times, but right now it felt like they were changing, warping into something else. And then, I heard footsteps, not behind me, ahead. I skidded to a stop. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on marble echoed from the corridor just around the corner. My pulse thundered in my ears. I stepped forward, peering around the bend, and came face to face with a portrait, except the face was missing. The painting was old, one of the first presidents, but his face had been wiped away, leaving only an empty, hollow void where his features should have been. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Something was horribly wrong here. Then, a whisper, right behind me. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the hall, my heart slamming against my ribs. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the chandeliers flickering overhead. The air felt wrong, thick, suffocating, pressing in like unseen hands. And then I saw the security checkpoint. Just a few more steps, just a little further. The power went out, total, complete darkness. And in that darkness, a breath, right in my ear. I lunged forward, blindly reaching for the door. My fingers fumbled over the handle, slick with sweat. I yanked it open. Light. I stumbled out into the security room, gasping for breath. The monitors flickered, the radios crackled with static, but everything else was normal. Like nothing had happened. I turned back, my body still trembling. The hallway behind me was empty, completely normal. No shadows, no figures, no whispers. Just the silent, gleaming corridors of the White House at midnight. I took one shaky step forward and felt the radio at my hip crackle to life one last time. And in that same, distorted, broken voice, they never left. I don't care how much they offer, how safe they say it is. I won't set foot inside that place after dark, because I know, deep in my bones, that something is still there, watching, waiting, and they never left. Like, share, and subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stay safe out there. It was an eerie, foggy evening when I first received the invitation. I'd been working as a historical researcher, diving into old documents about early American history, but nothing had prepared me for this. A handwritten letter, sealed with wax, arrived at my office. The letter spoke of an opportunity to visit a long-forgotten estate just outside of Washington, D.C., once home to Dolly Madison, the widow of President James Madison. The house had been abandoned for years, but now it seemed someone wanted to reveal its secrets. The letter was odd in its wording, warning me not to visit the house at night and urging me to come alone. The notion seemed like a foolish joke at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I became intrigued. I had always admired the history behind the Madison family and wondered if there was more to the story than what had been written in textbooks. The thought of stepping into the abandoned house was like stepping into a piece of history that had been lost for centuries. It was irresistible. I arrived at the house the next morning, eager and somewhat anxious. The mansion loomed in front of me, its once grand structure now a shadow of its former self. Tall, Gothic spires rose toward the sky, the dark windows like hollow eyes staring into the emptiness of the surrounding woods. The estate was completely isolated, situated miles away from the nearest town, and I could feel the air shift as I stepped closer to the front door. Something was off about this place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I rang the doorbell, and after a few moments the door creaked open. An elderly man stood before me, his face pale and gaunt, with deep lines etched into his skin. His eyes were hollow, but his smile seemed strangely warm despite the foreboding air of the place. "Welcome," he said in a rasping voice. "You're the historian, aren't you? I've been expecting you." His mannerisms were peculiar, and I wondered why he hadn't given me his name. But I couldn't let my suspicions cloud my judgment. He had opened the door to history itself, and I wasn't about to turn back now. He led me inside the mansion, and the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the silence was palpable. The walls seemed to echo the footsteps of someone long gone, but I felt no presence in the house, only a strange emptiness. "Dolly Madison," the man spoke again. "She believed in protecting this house and all its secrets, but some things are better left buried." His words were cryptic, and I could feel an unease creeping into my bones. As he spoke, his voice dropped to a whisper, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "Not everything in this house is meant for you to see, but you must, if you truly wish to understand." The man led me through the dimly lit hallways, past faded portraits of Dolly Madison and other figures from the early 1800s. The paintings seemed almost alive, their eyes following me as I walked by. I noticed the furnishings were covered with sheets, as if the house had been frozen in time. The chandeliers hung low, their crystal bulbs dulled by years of neglect. Despite the oppressive silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house seemed to breathe with its own life, as though it were waiting for something or someone. We finally reached a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. The man stopped, placing a key into the lock. "This is where it begins," he murmured. I felt a chill run down my spine. As the door creaked open, I was met with the sight of an old study, its walls lined with bookshelves that seemed to stretch on forever. A large desk sat in the center, papers scattered across it as if left in haste. But it wasn't the desk or the books that caught my attention. It was the chest. A large antique chest stood in the corner of the room, its lid slightly ajar. The man walked over to the chest and pulled it open, revealing several yellowed papers inside. "These documents belong to Dolly Madison herself," he explained. "But there's something else, something you'll have to see for yourself." My curiosity outweighed my doubts, and I approached the chest, kneeling beside it. The papers were covered with elaborate handwriting, their ink faded and hard to read. But the name at the top of one sheet was unmistakable: Dolly Madison. Below her name was a strange symbol, something I had never seen before, etched into the paper with care. Suddenly, the room grew colder. A gust of wind blew through the cracks in the old windows, and the papers fluttered on the desk. I could hear faint whispers like voices coming from the walls. My heart began to race as I tried to decipher the papers, but the words became blurry, the letters shifting in front of my eyes. Then, as if by instinct, I pulled out one of the documents and unfolded it. The page was a letter addressed to someone named Thomas, with a chilling message: "The house is cursed, and its secrets must never be revealed." The moment I finished reading the letter, I knew I had uncovered something dangerous. The man, who had been standing behind me, watched with a knowing gaze. "You shouldn't have seen that," he murmured, his voice low and strained. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I felt a chill settle in my bones. Something was wrong. The house was alive, breathing in the secrets it held, and it didn't want me to discover them. Without warning, the door slammed shut behind us, locking us inside the study. I tried to move, to run, but the door refused to open. The man's expression grew darker as he took a step toward me. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Dolly's curse. It's real. And now, you're part of it." I backed away from him, but he reached out and grabbed my wrist with unnatural strength. "There's no escape," he hissed. "Once you've learned too much, you'll never leave this house. The house claims its own." His grip tightened, and the whispers grew louder, filling my head. I could hear them clearly now, voices from another time, pleading for release, begging to be heard. Suddenly, the walls began to shake. The ground beneath me rumbled, as though the house itself were waking from a long, dark slumber. I glanced at the chest, which was now vibrating, the papers inside fluttering like they were alive. I realized then that I had made a terrible mistake by uncovering these secrets. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a prison, holding the spirits of those who had died under Dolly Madison's curse. The man's grip was still tight on my wrist, and I could see his eyes glowing with a malevolent energy. "You can't leave," he repeated, his voice now sounding distorted, unnatural. It was as if something had taken over him. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others before me. The temperature plummeted, and I could feel my breath turning to mist in the freezing air. The whispers grew louder, turning into full voices now, shouting in unison. "You should never have come," they screamed, their voices full of agony and despair. The old man's face twisted into a grotesque smile as he slowly released his grip on me. "Now you are part of this house, forever bound to it," he whispered, his voice fading into the cacophony of voices around me. I tried to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around me. The house was alive, the very walls pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. My head was spinning, and I stumbled backward, my hands clutching at the cold stone walls for support. I was trapped. There was no escape. I could feel the oppressive weight of the house closing in on me, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. The walls seemed to constrict, pulling me deeper into the darkness. Panic gripped my chest, and I struggled to breathe. My mind raced. Was this truly happening? Or was I simply losing my grip on reality? The man, if he could even be called that now, moved toward the chest once more, his movements jerky and unnatural. He muttered something under his breath, and the lid of the chest opened wider, as if it were calling to him. I didn't understand what he was doing, but I knew I couldn't let him finish whatever dark ritual he had in mind. With what little strength I had left, I fought through the dizziness and rushed toward him. "Stop!" I cried, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. His hands were shaking as he sifted through the papers, muttering to himself in a language I couldn't understand. The chest creaked and groaned, as though it were alive. The very air around me seemed to hum with dark energy. Just as I reached for him, the ground beneath me cracked. A deep, guttural sound echoed from beneath the floorboards. The walls groaned in protest, the old wood splintering. Suddenly, the chest snapped shut with a deafening crash, and a dark shadow surged from it, swirling around the room like a tornado. The man staggered backward, his face contorted in terror. The shadow seemed to ignore him, its form shifting and expanding until it filled the entire room. It was as if the house itself had come alive, releasing the dark forces that had been trapped within its walls for centuries. The air grew heavy with dread, and the whispers turned into screams, agonized cries that echoed in my mind, threatening to drown me. I felt myself pulled toward the center of the room, as if the very ground was dragging me in. The shadow surged toward me, and I knew in that moment that I had made a terrible mistake. I had uncovered the house's darkest secret, and now I was going to pay the price. There was no escape, no way out. But then something unexpected happened. The door to the study, which had been sealed shut moments earlier, suddenly flew open with a force that rattled the walls. A blinding light poured into the room, pushing back the darkness. The shadow recoiled, swirling and hissing like a wounded animal. I could hear the man scream in terror as he was swallowed by the blackness. His cries were abruptly cut off, and the house fell into silence once more. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Without thinking, I ran toward the door, stumbling over the uneven floor as I made my way down the hallway. The light from outside felt like a beacon of safety, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the exhaustion creeping through my limbs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath as I stood in the cold morning light. The mansion behind me loomed like a dark, menacing specter, but I didn't care. I had escaped. I was free. Or so I thought. When I looked back at the house one final time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The windows on the second floor, where there had been nothing but darkness before, now glowed with a faint flickering light. And in the window, I swear I saw a figure watching me, its eyes glowing in the dark. I turned away and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I never spoke of what happened that day, not to anyone. It's been years since I left that place, and I thought I had moved on. But every now and then, I feel an eerie presence watching me. I hear the whispers in my dreams, reminding me of the curse that still lingers in that house. Dolly Madison's secret was never meant to be uncovered, and now I fear it's a part of me. It's been years, but I still think about that mansion, the cursed house of President Madison's widow. I've heard rumors that people have tried to buy the property, only to be driven away by the unexplainable events that happen inside. The house remains abandoned, its dark history still buried beneath the walls. I thought I had escaped, that I had left that nightmare behind, but every so often, I find myself drawn back to it. The last time I visited Washington, I drove by the mansion, out of curiosity more than anything else. I stopped at the edge of the property, peering through the iron gates. To my surprise, I saw no sign of decay. The house looked almost restored. The windows were clear, the shutters hung perfectly, and the yard, though overgrown, had a certain order to it. But when I looked closer, I noticed something disturbing. There, at the front door, stood the same man I had met all those years ago. He was staring directly at me, his eyes hollow and empty. And just like before, he smiled, but this time it was wider, more twisted. And in that moment, I knew Dolly Madison's curse had never been lifted. It had only waited patiently for the next person to uncover its secrets. And so I left Washington for good. I couldn't bring myself to return to the house, and I couldn't bring myself to warn others. I don't know if it was the house itself or something far worse, but I've learned one thing for certain. Some secrets are better left buried, and some curses never die.